back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if it is your first time here. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my June wrap up, and I had an okay reading month for June. I read 4 books in total, but one of those books was almost 900 pages long, so I'm kind of taking that to be as though it could be 3 books all on its own. But yeah, and I pretty much enjoyed everything that I read, so let's just jump straight in. The first book that I read did feature on the thumbnail for my May wrap up, but I hadn't quite finished it, and in the end I decided that I just was going to save it and talk about it in June, and that is Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser. This book was so beautifully written and so vivid and so descriptive, and I really enjoyed it. It's set during the American Civil War, and we follow 2 main characters: Inman, a wounded soldier who has fled from the army and is trying to make his way back home, and Ada, a young woman of privilege whose life is turned upside down by the death of her father. And Ada is left on a homestead or a farm, and she has to learn to work the land all by herself, and Inman has to face various trials and tribulations as a deserter of the army trying to make his way back home, when deserters are being systematically rounded up and oftentimes killed on the spot. This was very much a quiet and slow book. There isn't much that happens by way of plot, and I do wish a little bit that it had gone into more detail about the American Civil War, because this is something that I haven't read much about. But having said all of that, something about this book just absolutely captured my attention. It captured my heart. I fell right into it. I didn't care that it was super slow. I didn't care that nothing really happened. I just loved the journey that this book took me on. I will say that I was a little bit disappointed with the ending, and it didn't quite fit with what I thought the narrative was going to be, but apart from that, I just really enjoyed it, and I'm really intrigued now to read some of Charles Fraser's other books, because if they're anything like this one, then I think I'm really going to enjoy them. The next book that I read in June was the mammoth one, and that is Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb. It will be no surprise to anybody who has watched any of my other videos that I loved this book. I am the biggest Robin Hobb fan, and this book just ticked all of the boxes for me. As I said, it's nearly 900 pages. It's a huge chunk of a book, and as is very typical for first books from Robin Hobb, not a lot happened. It was quite slow. It was very much about world building and setting the scene, and you could kind of see glimpses of what was going to happen, but not much in the way of action took place in this book. But it was full of rich descriptions, rich characters that really hooked you and took you in, and I just absolutely adored it. So if you asked me to describe this book, and with any Robin Hobb book, any basic description that you give really only ever scratches the surface. But if you had to ask me what this book was about, then I would say it's about magic and it's about pirates. But to go into a little bit more detail, the main focus of the book, or the main premise of this particular book, focuses around Wizardwood, and Wizardwood can only be retrieved from the Rainwilds, and the rivers of the Rainwilds can only be accessed by a live ship, which is a ship made from Wizardwood. And a live ship quickens, so kind of comes to life in a... Is it really alive? We don't know. That's something that we investigate in this book, when family members of 3 successive generations die on the decks of the ship, and then the ship quickens. So we begin the story with Vivacia, a live ship who is just about to quicken, and the story kind of unfolds from there. And it sounds a bit like, what are you talking about? But honestly, this book was just so good. Don't be intimidated by the size. Don't be intimidated by the fact that it's a little bit slow. I think if you love characters, if you love strong characters, and you love rich, fantastical worlds, then you will enjoy this book. And I loved it, and it took me nearly 3 weeks to read it, but I really enjoyed it. The next book that I read was 1984 by George Orwell. This is obviously a modern classic, and I picked this up after buddy reading The Circle with Jordan, and she observed that The Circle had taken a lot of its inspiration from 1984 and suggested that we read this one together as well, which we did. And if you aren't familiar with the story, then this is a sci-fi dystopian book which is set in a world where the world has been split into 3 super states, and our protagonist Winston lives in Oceania, or Oceania, I don't know how you're supposed to say it, which I think is an amalgamation of the UK and the USA, and is basically governed by the all-seeing, all-knowing, infallible Big Brother. Big Brother is all about suppressing the individual, it's about suppressing freedom of thought and eliminating any relationships which may take your commitment or your dedication away from Big Brother. So you marry for convenience and you reproduce children for convenience, not because you are in love with somebody and that kind of thing. So when Winston meets a girl called Julia and they kind of have a blossoming romance, then our story sort of ensues from there. This was a lot harder to read than I imagined that it would be for such a short book, and it felt very dense and quite slow, and I don't know if that's because in my head I had got it in the dystopian category, and in a lot of modern, particularly YA dystopian books, it's very action filled and it's very much about fighting against the regime, and I had sort of expected something similar from this, and so the lack of action made it feel a little bit slower than it perhaps was, but I thought that it still made a lot of very interesting and intriguing observations which are relevant even in today's society, and I'm really glad that I read it. And after The Mammoth Ship of Magic and 1984, I wanted something a little bit more fast paced, so I picked up one of my go-to authors, and that was Robert Goddard, and I chose Fault Line. Robert Goddard is a psychological thriller writer, and I always enjoy everything that he writes. I know that some people feel he's a little bit formulaic, but I quite like knowing exactly what I'm going to get when I pick one of his books up. This one probably wasn't my favourite book that he's written. I actually thought that although he still managed to kind of be the master of the triple cross, as it were, you think you're going in one direction and then you realise you're going in another, and then you realise it's something entirely different. I did think that the overall story was actually a little bit boring. As usual with Robert Goddard books, the protagonist is sort of a in the wrong place at the wrong time type of character, and that was very true for this one. It's about a young guy who ends up being party to a series of family dramas, I suppose, murders and deaths and mysteries, and he didn't really mean to, and we follow him throughout his entire life as he sort of has to remain hooked and connected to this family, and this family own a china clay business, and it's international, and it's intrigue, and it's missing documents, and it's what really is going on at the very bottom of all of these different things. So it's quite difficult to explain without being spoilery. I enjoyed it. As I said, it had an ending that I hadn't quite guessed, which I always love about his books. He's very, very good at the misdirection in a story, but it wasn't my favourite one of his, but enjoyable nonetheless. So there you go, they are the books that I read in the month of June. As I said, I had a pretty good reading month. I didn't read as much as I had hoped, and I'm hoping that in July I will get through a few more books, but I enjoyed pretty much everything that I read. As always, do leave me a comment down below letting me know anything that you read and enjoyed in the month of June. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to give me the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for more content, and I will see you all soon.